At 06:32 hours on a gray April morning in 1944, over the cold waters west of the Mariana Islands, a young U.S. Navy pilot squeezed his trigger and watched certainty dissolve into smoke. Lieutenant Harold "Red" Mallory had done everything by the book. His F-6F Hellcat sat perfectly behind a Japanese A-6M0, barely 800 yards off the enemy's tail, close enough to see the red Hinomaru trembling on the wing. The Zero was not diving, not rolling, not even jinking hard, just a shallow climbing turn toward broken cloud. Mallory had altitude, position, and surprise. He pressed the firing stud. The 6.50 caliber machine guns roared, but only 3 answered. The others coughed once and fell silent. Tracers stitched the sky wide of the target as the Zero tightened its turn and slipped into the overcast. In the space of 5 seconds, advantage turned to confusion. Mallory felt the cold realization crawl up his spine. The enemy had not won. The system had failed. And this was not the first time. Across the Pacific in 1943 and early 1944, American pilots were discovering that victory required more than courage and more than machines stamped out by Detroit. It required preparation for the right war. Official briefings blamed isolated malfunctions, bad ammunition belts, humid air, salt corrosion. Debriefs ended with phrases like mechanical variance and pilot error. But the pattern was spreading from the Solomon Islands to the Central Pacific. Guns jammed after short bursts. New pilots hesitated in tight turns because they had been drilled to preserve formation discipline, not to break and fight alone. Training emphasized coordinated interception of lumbering bombers, not savage one-on-one knife fights against agile fighters that could pivot inside a heartbeat. The doctrine had been written for a different enemy. Before the war, planners imagined waves of high-altitude bombers threatening the fleet. Fighters were guardians of the perimeter, flying calculated intercept geometry against predictable paths. Close-range maneuvering was considered secondary, almost wasteful. Fuel economy, radio coordination, and altitude discipline mattered more than raw dogfighting instinct. Then reality arrived in the form of the Mitsubishi A-6M0. Light, nimble, merciless. Young American aviators found themselves dragged into low-speed turning duels their manuals had warned them to avoid, but had never truly prepared them to survive. Some adapted through instinct and luck. Others did not return. By late 1943, the U.S. Navy's kill ratios were improving thanks to better aircraft like the Hellcat. But beneath the statistics lay uncomfortable truths. Many replacement pilots reached combat zones having never sparred against a dissimilar aircraft flown by an instructor trying to defeat them. They had practiced formation gunnery and textbook intercepts, not desperate improvisation. Maintenance crews quietly reported recurring stoppages linked to ammunition feed systems under high G loads, yet reports moved slowly through bureaucratic channels already swollen with victory narratives. After Mallory's near-fatal encounter, his squadron intelligence officer wrote a concise line in the mission summary. Partial armament failure. Enemy evaded into cloud. It sounded routine. It was anything but. Senior officers in Pearl Harbor began to sense a structural weakness hidden beneath industrial strength. If America's vast production could place thousands of fighters in the sky, why were individual engagements still hinging on improvisation instead of doctrine? Why were some squadrons thriving while others bled? The uncomfortable answer pointed not only to equipment, but to culture. Training syllabi had not kept pace with the enemy's style. Instructors who had never faced a Zero were teaching young men how to fight one. Simulated opponents flew predictable arcs. No one mimicked the sudden climbing spiral or the deceptive slow-speed roll that Japanese veterans used to deadly effect. The war was evolving faster than the manuals. When investigators dug deeper into training records, what they found was almost surreal. When air-to-air practice happened at all, it was choreographed theater. F-4s flying against other F-4s, wingmen pulling punches, nobody truly trying to win because everyone had to share the same ready room afterward. The language in the findings remained polite, almost antiseptic, but the implication was devastating. For more than a decade, the Navy had prepared to intercept Soviet bombers in a nuclear nightmare and had quietly allowed the art of the dogfight to atrophy. The culture that grew out of that assumption hardened into something pilots bitterly nicknamed the Missile Mafia, a circle of senior officers whose careers were built on radar intercept theory and beyond visual range doctrine. These were the men shaping procurement boards, writing syllabi, deciding what mattered. They had championed the removal of internal guns from the F-4 Phantom. They had structured training around Sparrow and Sidewinder envelopes. They believed the future battlefield began at 20 miles, not 2,000 feet. Alt's conclusions did more than criticize equipment. They threatened reputations and an entire intellectual architecture. Some admirals argued Vietnam was an outlier, a political war with artificial rules of engagement. They insisted performance would improve once crews logged more hours with the missile systems. That claim rang hollow in squadron ready rooms where photographs of the dead were still taped inside lockers. Experience with flawed preparation only produces more funerals. The internal fight that followed was not dramatic in public, but inside the Pentagon it was fierce and personal. Captain Dan Pedersen, who had flown over North Vietnam and watched missile shots miss at ranges that should have been textbook kills, refused to let the report become another shelved document. He had been warning about adversary training since 1967. Now he had 242 pages of evidence. His proposal was simple and radical at the same time. Build a school dedicated entirely to air combat maneuvering. Study Soviet doctrine. Replicate the tactics North Vietnamese pilots were actually using. Strip away comfort. Strip away ego. Teach fighters to fight again. To the missile loyalists, this sounded like regression. A nostalgic return to World War II, turning duels they considered obsolete. A declassified memo would later describe the concept as incompatible with modern air warfare. Yet the kill ratio told a different story, and the Chief of Naval Operations reached a point where theory could no longer outrank arithmetic. Authorization came despite resistance. Thus, in March 1969, at Naval Air Station Miramar in California, the Navy Fighter Weapons School opened its doors. The nickname came almost immediately, Top Gun, and it carried a tone of challenge rather than glamour. There was no grand funding line, no polished infrastructure. Pedersen borrowed 4 Skyhawks from attack squadrons to mimic MiG performance. He secured space where he could find it and drafted the first syllabus by hand. 8 students began the inaugural class. What they encountered was unlike anything in the fleet. No scripted intercepts, no cooperative merges. Every engagement was 1 versus 1 or 2 versus 2 against instructors whose sole mission was to defeat them. The curriculum drilled energy management, nose position, turn rate control, and how to counter specific maneuvers documented from combat footage and intelligence assessments. Instructors flew the A-4 as if it were a MiG. Aggressive, willing to bleed speed into a scissors fight where the heavier Phantom became vulnerable. Students accustomed to believing in technological superiority were shocked to find themselves consistently outmaneuvered by a subsonic attack jet. The humiliation was deliberate. It exposed a truth that Vietnam had already proven. Aircraft capability sets the boundaries, but pilot skill determines the outcome inside those boundaries. The change was visible long before the shooting started again. When Top Gun graduates returned to their carriers, squadron ready rooms felt different. Briefs were sharper. Formations were tighter. Younger pilots who once relied on instinct now spoke fluently about energy states, lift vectors, and turn circles. During exercises over the Pacific, engagements that looked unwinnable on paper began ending in quiet, clinical victories. The F-4 Phantom, once criticized as too heavy, too dependent on unreliable missiles, started behaving like a predator again. Then history accelerated. In December 1971, as negotiations in Paris unraveled, President Richard Nixon authorized renewed pressure on North Vietnam. Planning for Operation Linebacker moved forward with urgency. Carrier air wings in the Gulf of Tonkin understood what that meant. deep penetrations into heavily defended airspace, dense surface-to-air missile belts, and determined MiG opposition. It was precisely the crucible the Miramar experiment had been built for. By early 1972, just over 100 aviators had passed through the Navy Fighter Weapons School. A small number compared to the entire fleet, but they were strategically placed. They were flight leads, training officers, the voices that shaped how squadrons thought before launch. In VF-96, two of those graduates were Lieutenant Randy Cunningham and his radar intercept officer Willie Driscoll. Squadron mates said they flew as if the aircraft anticipated their decisions. Other carriers carried their own Miramar alumni, scattered but influential, seeds planted across the Pacific. When Linebacker began in May 1972, the sky over North Vietnam filled with strike packages sometimes exceeding 40 aircraft, layered with electronic jamming and wild weasel escorts hunting missile batteries. On the ground, controllers of the Vietnam People's Air Force scrambled to respond. The 921st Fighter Regiment, equipped primarily with MiG-21s, had rebuilt after a relative lull in 1971. Soviet advisors had helped improve maintenance and training pipelines, yet many of their younger pilots had never faced opponents shaped by the new American doctrine. Nguyen Van Bai, who had joined the regiment in 1969 and trained in the Soviet Union, remembered earlier encounters when American phantoms would accept turning duels almost eagerly. That pattern was gone. In May 1972, MiG pilots reported something unsettling. The F-4s were no longer predictable. They conserved energy, refused disadvantageous merges, and countered slashing attacks with disciplined reversals that forced MiGs into defensive spirals. The first week of Linebacker was brutal. On May 6th, 2 MiG-21s were lost without confirmed American losses. On May 8th, 3 MiG-17 fell for minimal U.S. damage. The ratios were shifting decisively. Ground controllers struggled to vector fighters effectively against complex American formations protected by electronic warfare screens. Then came May 10, 1972, a day that would become one of the largest air battles of the war. That morning, the 921st launched multiple flights, 16 MiGs in total, attempting to fracture inbound strike groups before they reached Hanoi and Haiphong. American radar screens lit up with contacts. F-4 crews, many trained at Miramar, executed practiced contracts, bracket maneuvers, mutual support turns, disciplined missile shots taken inside reliable envelopes rather than hopeful long-range launches. The sky devolved into twisting contrails and short, violent merges. What distinguished these encounters from 1968 was not luck, it was geometry and patience. Phantom crews forced MiGs to commit first, then punished them when they bled energy. By day's end, several North Vietnamese fighters had been destroyed. Among the American aviators scoring that day were Cunningham and Driscoll, who would eventually become the Navy's only aces of the war. Their success was not mystical, it was procedural, born from countless debriefs in which every mistake had been dissected without mercy. Nguyen Van Bai lifted off from Kep in his MiG-17 just after 1,000 hours. Engines screaming against humid air as controllers vectored his ship toward an incoming Alpha strike aimed at fuel storage near Hai Duong. Radar plots showed a wall of American aircraft, attack jets shielded by phantoms flying disciplined cover. Bai's leader barely had time to call tally before a flash tore through the formation. A sidewinder struck within the first half-minute. The MiG disintegrated. Bai never saw the shooter. Seconds later, another explosion blossomed to his right. 2 aircraft gone in under a minute. Training told him to press. Instinct told him to survive. He broke hard, rolled low, and dove toward the Red River Delta, cannon shells from unseen phantoms stitching past his wing. He limped back to Kep with 12 holes in his left wing and a question he could not answer. How had the Americans gotten inside their timing so completely? By sunset, ground crews confirmed 12 MiGs lost that day. The U.S. Navy lost 2 aircraft, both to surface-to-air missiles. Soviet advisors drafted restrained summaries, adverse engagement outcomes, tactical imbalance. The language was diplomatic. The meaning was not. The Americans were fighting a different war now. That same morning at 0930, Lieutenant Randy Cunningham and his RIO Willie Driscoll launched from the carrier USS Constellation in F-4, J Bureau number 157267, call sign Showtime 100. Their assignment was straightforward on paper: escort a 16-plane strike with 8 Phantoms providing cover. Radar soon filled with contacts rising from Kep, Fuck Yen, Gia Lam. The first merge came quickly. Cunningham's section met 4 MiG-17 climbing through 8,000 feet. The Vietnamese formation spacing looked hurried, uneven. Cunningham chose vertical geometry, pulling sharply upward to exploit the Phantom's thrust. One MiG tried to follow and stalled high, momentarily suspended. Cunningham rolled, dove, and fired from above. The missile struck cleanly. Moments later, alerted by Driscoll's calm voice, he broke into another overshooting MiG and secured a second kill. The sky then fractured into overlapping radio calls, contrails, and flashing silver wings. In a low-altitude duel with a skilled MiG pilot who understood energy management, Cunningham resorted to a tactic refined in training: an abrupt vertical maneuver combined with throttle cut and speed brake deployment. The Phantom decelerated violently. The MiG flashed past. Cunningham repositioned and launched his final Sidewinder. 3 victories in a single sortie. The engagement lasted barely minutes. The consequences echoed for years. Intelligence officers debriefed the crew for hours, dissecting every maneuver. Gun camera film confirmed the geometry. Across the battle space that day, Navy crews claimed 8 MiGs, while the Air Force added several more. The Vietnam People's Air Force immediately reduced sortie rates. The shock was tactical and psychological. For years, MiG pilots had relied on forcing heavy American fighters into turning contests. Now those fighters were dictating the terms. In the weeks that followed, interception attempts grew more cautious. Vietnamese formations avoided immediate merges and sought coordinated attacks from altitude, but American escorts anticipated these shifts. The Navy's kill ratio during the 1972 campaign soared compared to earlier years. Analysts later tied much of that improvement to training reform rather than hardware upgrades. The same F-4 Phantom that struggled in 1968 was suddenly dominant in 1972. The difference lay in preparation, discipline, and ruthless debrief culture. Over Hanoi and Haiphong, Doctrine had been rewritten in real time. The linebacker operations continued through summer and culminated in the December strikes known as Linebacker 2, but May 10th became a symbolic turning point. It demonstrated that institutional humility, acknowledging failure, rebuilding training from first principles, could shift the balance of air combat. For the week after May 10th, the pattern hardened into something unmistakable. North Vietnamese fighters no longer rushed toward incoming American strike packages on first vector. Ground controllers hesitated, recalculated, sometimes withheld launches entirely unless they believed they held overwhelming numerical advantage. Even then, instructions carried an edge of restraint that had been absent 4 years earlier. By May 18th, during Operation Linebacker, the overall air-to-air exchange ratio stood at roughly 12.5 American kills for every loss. The Navy's figures were stronger still. The transformation was mathematical proof of what Miramar had engineered. The same F-4 Phantom, facing largely the same adversary aircraft, was now fighting with an entirely different intellectual framework. Archival radio intercepts reveal the psychological shift. In one transcript dated May 12th, a North Vietnamese controller issues a blunt command to a MiG flight after radar identifies escorting Phantoms. Disengage immediately, return to base, do not pursue. That phrasing would have been unthinkable in 1968, when aggressive interception was routine despite losses. Something fundamental had changed. The Vietnamese leadership recognized it, even if they could not immediately counter it. Between May and October 1972, Top Gun graduates, still a small minority of the total fighter force, accounted for a disproportionate share of victories. Out of 55 Navy air-to-air kills in that period, 36 were credited to crews who had passed through the fighter weapons school. Roughly 8% of the community was generating nearly 2/3 of the results. Names repeated in combat summaries because the training pipeline had created a distinct tactical elite. Instructors embedded in operational squadrons who multiplied their influence every time they briefed a mission. The Vietnam People's Air Force could not absorb losses at that pace indefinitely. May 1972 alone cost them more than 24 aircraft in air combat. June saw fewer engagements, July fewer still. By August, intercept attempts were rare and carefully staged. Intelligence assessments from mid-1972 noted North Vietnamese controllers identifying certain American call signs as high threat and advising avoidance where possible. Analysts believed this pattern correlated directly with prior engagement outcomes. In effect, the VPAF was tracking which Phantom crews had demonstrated superior tactical proficiency and steering younger pilots away from them. Soviet advisory reports from the summer of 1972, later declassified, described morale erosion and acknowledged systematic disadvantages against enhanced American training methods. The issue was not hardware disparity alone. It was tempo and confidence. Sortie statistics tell an even clearer story than kill ratios. Between May 10th and May 15th, VPAF fighters launched nearly 90 sorties against American strikes. In the following 2 weeks, that number dropped to roughly 1/3, despite the continued intensity of U.S. operations. American strike packages did not shrink. Targets did not soften. Yet MiGs increasingly remained on the ground or loitered at altitude without committing. Vietnamese archival maintenance data indicates that key regiments remained operationally capable through much of the summer. Aircraft availability was not the limiting factor. The limiting factor was expected outcome. One particularly revealing intercept from late May records a MiG-21 flight ordered to hold at altitude and observe an American formation. No descent, no engagement, simply maintain readiness. The strike group completed its run unchallenged. The controller concluded with a routine return to base. The mission had been surveillance, not interception. Whether that reflected standing orders or momentary caution is unclear, but its symbolism is stark. By early autumn 1972, the VPAF concentrated almost exclusively on defending Hanoi and its immediate approaches. Peripheral targets were conceded. By late summer 1972, the pattern was unmistakable. Outside the dense surface-to-air missile belts guarding Hanoi and Haiphong, American strike packages moved with a confidence that would have been unimaginable 4 years earlier. When MiGs appeared, they struck once and vanished. High-speed slashes, a quick cannon burst or missile attempt, then immediate disengagement. No more prolonged turning duels. No more drawn-out scissors fights over the Red River Delta. The kill ratio remained brutally uneven through October, when Operation Linebacker wound down. 55 North Vietnamese aircraft destroyed in air combat. 4 American fighters lost to MiGs. The remaining U.S. losses, 24 aircraft, fell to SAMs and anti-aircraft fire. Technology had improved since 1968. Yes, missiles were more reliable, radar sets were sharper. But the F-4 Phantom flying in 1972 was not a revolutionary new machine. It was, in essence, the same heavy interceptor that had struggled years earlier. The decisive variable was the human one. Training, mindset, doctrine. The Vietnam People's Air Force was built around Soviet theory, mass, coordination, acceptable attrition in preparation for a vast European war. That logic collapses in a limited conflict where the entire fighter inventory numbers barely over 100 and every loss erodes both capability and morale. Post-war internal assessments, gradually declassified in the 1990s and 2000s, are striking in their candor. A regimental analysis from August 1972 described engagements against American formations as tactically untenable under prevailing conditions. Page after page dissects encounters where Vietnamese pilots followed established procedures precisely and were shot down anyway. The authors noted that American aviators displayed maneuvering patterns inconsistent with previous years. In other words, the enemy had evolved. A November 1972 advisory summary from attached Soviet officers recorded observable morale degradation beginning in May. Pilots showed reluctance to engage even when holding numerical advantage. Standard responses produced unfavorable outcomes with increasing regularity. Recommendations included broad tactical retraining and psychological reinforcement programs. None could be implemented quickly enough to influence the December escalation of Operation Linebacker II. By then, strategic momentum had already shifted. There are fragments that linger in the archives. Intercepts instructing MiG pilots to avoid extended engagement with specific American call signs, maintenance logs from Kep Airfield listing aircraft grounded faster than parts could arrive, logistics reports citing shortages in MiG-17 hydraulic assemblies and MiG-21 radar components. Between May 10th and May 15th alone, multiple fighters returned riddled with damage. Others never returned at all. Repair crews worked beyond capacity. Aircraft sat idle awaiting Soviet shipments. A July personnel summary quietly listed more than 20 pilots temporarily removed from combat status for medical evaluation. An antiseptic phrase that in translated annexes corresponds to what Soviet advisors termed combat exhaustion. Survivors of repeated engagements who could no longer climb back into the cockpit. The VPAF attempted adaptation. June Doctrine revisions emphasized strict hit-and-run attacks. One pass, disengage, never commit to a sustained maneuvering contest. A few seasoned aviators executed this with discipline and survived. But most pilots were young, often with only a few hundred flight hours, facing American crews hardened by a rigorous training culture and far greater cumulative experience. The disparity widened with every engagement. One of the more sobering post-war analyses, completed in 1976 by Vietnamese military historians, reflects on the air campaign with restrained but unmistakable clarity. It acknowledges that American tactical reform altered the operational environment faster than North Vietnamese doctrine could respond. The study does not frame the outcome as technological inevitability.